watching and listening to Bishop Brothers, a safe space where real issues being dealt with by real people are brought forth and discussed. Every week, the fire of love is lit as two 21st century bishops share the first century church message. Join and engage in the conversations, featuring grassroots interviews, book reviews, and God-inspired commentary. Here are your hosts, Aaron and John, Bishop and Bishop, Chief and Chief. But above all, they are brothers. Welcome aboard.
Happy New Year.
Hey, there it is.
2023.
Guess who's back?
Wow, we're back.
Man, 2023. You know that we started this in 2019. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it's like, wow, it's 2023. Like, time does not stop.
No, it does
not wait. It does not take a break.
Mm-mm.
And I tell you, God is good. It's just a good to, tell people sticking with things and not worried about all the other stuff. It's good. And it's just good to be back for another year, another season, finish up this season of Bishop Brothers, man. It really is.
Yeah, no, it's been really good. So, right before we left, we talked about scars.
Yeah.
And man, it has hit the ground running.
It's not good, yeah.
All the great things I'm hearing about it, it's really exciting. Really exciting.
And now tonight we're gonna look at your great work, your latest work that you released. I think you released yours like November 3rd, right at Thanksgiving.
I did, yeah. We did a soft release around November, right after Thanksgiving.
So now it's out there in all formats.
It's all out there now.
All formats, all over the place. Amazon, paperback, and everything. And I'm just excited about it because I read it on my little Christmas cruise. I had read it, but I took time just to dig deeper, and it's really good. The name of the book is "Exchanges Greenness for Whiteness: How the Irish in America Surrender the Culture for the Privilege of Whiteness." And before we get into it, I want you to explain your because I always, one of these book reviews, when I look at book reviews, I always like to get the authors. What gives you the it's not the perfect. You got every area, but just tell the people about that. Everybody that don't know why you picked this particular topic. And it's based on your heritage. And
it is. Yeah. So my parents, Irish immigrants. Whole family's Irish.
And you took a trip this summer.
And we did. We took a trip to Ireland with my oldest. It was a great trip. It was very very healing, for the soul. It was nice to go back and kind of connect with those pieces of me. I always tell people, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm an American, that I'm a Texan, but I also am Irish, and it's a privilege to have such a rich history. But one of the things that I've noticed over time, and kind of the impetus of writing the book, actually the title is actually a statement that comes from a book that we reviewed 2 years ago, called "How the Irish Became White," and that book, it kind of explains some of what this book explains about how the Irish kind of morphed from pre-famine not being considered white to post-famine, post-Civil War being considered white. So it really kind of discussed that journey. Greenness for Whiteness kind of focused a little bit more on the how that happened, right? And there were actually more Irish living in this country than there are in Ireland, right? More Irish heritage here than in Ireland, and that's because of the famine, which, by the way, wasn't a famine. It was a genocide perpetrated on the Irish people by the British Empire. But what I came to realize, there's a lot of us here that don't know our history, right? And we think, because we've grown up believing that we've been kind of part of the white ascendancy the whole time, we didn't really know the history of just how poorly our ancestors were treated. And it's important for a couple things. Here's what's not important about it. This is not the oppression Olympics, right? The goal of the book is not to go, see, black people, we had it just as bad as you, because that's unfair, and it's two completely different things in time and space. What should have happened from this book, what I think Noel Ingetev wanted from his book, was instead of talking about who had it worse, me or you, why can't we look at it like we both had it bad? Let's move forward together in lockstep to try to fix some of these things. instead of being on opposite ends as if we've always been enemies. And that's not true. We actually, the impetus of the book is we actually have way more in common with indigenous and African peoples in this country historically than we do with other white culture.
I'm reading a book on a cruise, and what something we talked about since we met each other. We met each other a few years ago, right in to give context, right in the Kaepernick situation. Remember, we read each other and the kneeling and things like that, and it was a fervor about that. I was right in the heart of that.
Yeah,
that's when we met each other. And I'm reading your book, and I'm looking at your prologue, and it's one thing that I like to get to lay the foundation for this conversation is one thing a book like that always makes me feel, always makes me think and makes me understand that this construct or this theme or this thing we call white or black or whatever, that's a construct.
Yeah.
Your book is a real good testament to, let's get back to what this thing we even call white was constructed. Yeah. Racism is real, but race is fiction, and it's fiction was made a reality. And I think that's, if people can start when they read your book, understanding that we're talking about something that was constructed, because Irish people in Ireland, you tell me if I'm wrong, going back to history, so you got the history of the Celtic people, they think of themselves as white.
Right.
And so that's really when you start the book, I hope you get this book, that you really understand, because we don't, we're raised in a society, raised in a culture, we think this has always been, but people didn't always run around calling themselves black or white. This was a construct created. That's right. And so the construct is the beginning of the destruction, going to the depths.
Yeah, and it's important to realize that the idea of whiteness doesn't occur until about the 14th or 15th century in Portugal, of all places. So, especially early on, the Celts didn't understand. They wouldn't have referred to themselves as white. What I do kind of trace over time is the idea of supremacy that starts with the Roman Empire, right? With Romans who saw themselves as superior to the people around them. It just so happened the people to their north and west were Celtic, right? What a lot of people don't understand about the Celtic peoples is most of Europe was Celtic land. One of the things I try to bring home in the book is discussing the similarities between the indigenous First Nations here in North America and the Celtic people and how they were dealt with by the Romans. It was a very similar, it's like a playbook. The Romans taught Europe how to get rid of indigenous people, right? And then when those countries became independent, when you have England that comes about after 1066, they inherit that playbook from the Romans. And so the English then use that playbook on Scotland, Wales, Isle of Man, and Ireland, right, to form their empire. Ireland was Britain's first colony, and it's their last, as Northern Ireland is still really under colonial rule. The thing about understanding the Celtic peoples is how similar they were treated, although thousands of years apart, in the same way that the indigenous people were treated here. It's a playbook that the English passed to the Americans, right? And that playbook runs all the way back to Roman times, and the first people that playbook was used on was Celts, right? So we have that in common.
Yeah, when you see things, because your chapter 3 is about the Native American people, when you see things, normally it's not nothing new. It's very really rare. People follow trends and follow, and colonialism, that started well before this taking of this land. It's I guess it's how they look at people, and they had this doctrine of discovery and things like that, and it was did this, because you talking about the indigenous people, so one of them asked, did they have the same doctrine of discovery as that was promoted here, that manifest destiny? We have a divine right to this land. Right. God sent us here to take your land. Right. The justification, or was it different for them?
Yeah. So for the English, it was very similar. Right. God had given them the providence to rule over. To rule over things. Rome was a little different in that it wasn't God, because they weren't monotheistic, right? The early Romans were polytheistic. But in kind of baked into all three of those situations is this idea of the land is there for the taking, because the people that live on the land are not considered people, right? They are less than. They are savages. Mm-hmm. That was used against the Celtic people, right? Like, and you hear all these wild stories about the Celts used to fight naked and they murdered and they ate people. You know, these are the same stories these are the same tropes that are then paraded out against the Irish in Ireland, and then those same tropes are even used against the Native Americans here, right? You hear all these, they're savages, they have no culture, they're not cultured. That same concept of, yes, there are, you know, subhumans living on that land, but because they're not Romans, because they're not English, because they're not white, they are not considered equal to us. Mm-hmm. And therefore, since there are no people with what would be considered real heritage or lineage, right? That land is there for the taking. Yeah. Yeah.
Review. Let's talk about reviews before we get back in. So, I remember when you put it out, you pre-release, and you showed me you got this trash. I call it trash review.
Yeah.
I don't know what he was, but you know, from your perspective, why are people particularly like maybe with the Irish American background heritage like you? Mm-hmm. What makes them angry about why would they get angry at this? You got your facts, you got your sources, everything in the book. What you mad for?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been asking myself that most of my life, but I think with Irish Americans, one, there is a huge amount of pride in being Irish American, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having pride in being Irish American. Mm-hmm. The rub comes, the problem comes when you refuse to understand or learn about your own history, right? And so, but the other problem is in public schools, very similar to the African American experience, right? We have been provided a whitewashed history of our history as well. Mm-hmm. As much as they've whitewashed, you know, slavery, and I mean to the point where we can't even really talk about it in school anymore, right? Mm-hmm. In some places. They've done the same thing with Irish history, right? So they'll tell you, for example, they'll say, well, some of the founding fathers were Irish, and a lot of people take a lot of pride in that. But as I explained in the book, the founding fathers did not come from Irish Celtic background. They came from what was called the Ulster Plantation, right? These were Scottish people who had been moved into Northern Ireland to basically breed out the Irish and create a more amenable people so that they would be easily subjected to the British Empire, right? Mm-hmm. And so once they had kind of run the gambit in the north, they then moved it. Those people who were very wealthy then moved to the colonies. Mm-hmm. So before 1845, the quote unquote Irish that are coming here are ascendancy, right? They are wealthy. They're very wealthy Scotch Irish, right? And so a lot of people identify with that history and they're very proud of it. All I'm saying in the book is there is another group of Irish that came here after 1845 that actually most of us are related to as Irish Americans. Very few of us are related to Ulster Scots, right? Because there were so few of them that came before, right? After the famine starts. And I think people don't want to admit we actually come from, you know, these immigrants that were poor and treated poorly, right? We want to claim the ascendancy from the founding fathers. And so when you tell somebody that something they've been taught in school is wrong, they're going to buck against that until they read it for themselves. The other issue is the potato famine itself, right? In every history book, it's called a potato famine. The reality is it was not a potato famine, right? What most people don't realize, yes, there was a potato blight that killed the potato crops in Ireland. But in the British Empire, Ireland was producing the most corn, the most beef, the most flour in the entire British Empire. But they were exporting it all to make money because the land didn't belong to the Irish, it belonged to the British. And the British weren't going to make money feeding the stock, right? And so they would send it overseas to India to feed the army, or they would send it other places. And as people started to die because they weren't being fed, because the only thing they were allowed to keep was the potato crops, they would say, oh, it's the famine's fault, right? Oh, this really sad thing happened and it's really unfortunate. But the reality is the British knew the problem and they didn't want to fix it, and they intentionally allowed people to starve, and it created mass immigration where there are more people now living in Australia and the United States that are Irish heritage than there are in Ireland. Ireland's population is still lower than it was in 1845.
Wow. Wow.
Over 150 years later.
You got a chapter on shared trauma. And here's issue that I had, because a lot of times I've heard, it's like we have a trauma. Everybody wants to race to see who's the most traumatized.
Right, the oppression Olympics.
Oppression is oppression, and trauma is trauma. Yeah. And a lot of times people say that the Irish were slaves in this country, things like that. Let's just set the record straight on that. I mean, I know that the Irish were not slaves as African Americans were slaves.
Right.
They were not slaves, but it's not that doesn't mean that the Irish didn't go through their trauma no different than the Native Americans with their trauma.
Yeah.
I think we need to quit battling over the history book. The history of the record is clear. Who was, what status, who was enslaved, who was not enslaved, whose name was stolen. But I think we need to I like what you got, your shared trauma. There's a sharing of trauma based on white supremacy. Yeah. Let's focus on putting the blame or the who did it on who did it. Right. No matter the trauma our ancestors suffered, they suffered, but the blame is it was white supremacy. Right. That was the driving force of all the trauma, whether taking land, enslaving, and all of it. Yeah. Yeah,
and I think a very important thing, because this trope gets thrown every March 17th. That's when everybody decides they want to be Irish. Mm-hmm. But nobody knows anything about the Easter Rising, or there are other parts of Irish history that are way more rich in depth than March 17th. But around March 17th, this trope always comes out. They'll have some picture of little kid. There was one where there's these little kids look like they've been in a coal mine all day. Right, they're all nasty, and it says the Irish were slaves too, but you don't hear us complaining. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, let's break down that meme. First of all, that picture, that specific picture, is of kids in Belgium. Right. Right, from the 1900s. We're not even talking about the 1800s. Right. Okay. So already we've got a problem. Okay. Let's talk about the slavery issue. We have to understand the Irish were never slaves in this country, ever. You cannot equate indentured servitude with chattel slavery. Right. Right? Because indentured servitude, you could leave. Mm-hmm. Indentured servitude, you could choose to enter into. You signed a contract. The last time I checked, no slave was allowed to leave, or in Africa decided to sign a contract to say, I want to come to America and have me and my ancestor treated like property for 400 years. I doubt that happened, right? So we have to get off that trope. That's the first thing we have to, as Irish Americans, we have to get off of that. Right, that is, we're doing our own culture and history a disservice, and we are certainly disrespecting African culture, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have to get off that trope as Irish Americans. The other part of that trope, did the Irish suffer? Yes, right? But we suffered in Ireland. Mm-hmm. We suffered in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Montserrat, a lot of people don't realize that's called Little Ireland. A lot of people in Montserrat, or I think it's been evacuated now, but the people that were living in Montserrat, a lot of them had green eyes and reddish hair, and they were African. Mm-hmm. That's because they had African slaves and Irish penal colonists, right? People that had been convicted of crimes against the crown in Ireland and then gang pressed into working alongside Africans in places like Montserrat. That's the closest I think you can get to saying that the Irish were slaves, was in the Caribbean. At no point ever in this country were we slaves. Did we come here en masse and we were treated poorly? Mm-hmm. Were we treated like second-class citizens? Mm-hmm. Yes. But to say we were slaves is grossly inaccurate.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we need to tell, because people are so afraid of history. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how afraid of history are. But again, the people who did the slavery, who created race, can create this construct to get to the point where the Irish coalesce, and what gets that coalesce into whiteness, right, is because it became what has always been from the beginning about power. Right. Chapter 5, what a title, Negroes Inside Out. And you got a statement I want to read. You got a quote from Douglas, and I want to read. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, the great American, who I believe is the greatest American in this country ever produced. One Frederick Douglass. He was great friends with Daniel O'Connell, as we talked about on this show before. Yeah. He wrote this. He said, the Irish who at home readily sympathize with the oppressed everywhere are instantly taught when they step on our soil to hate and despise the Negro. Put in context what he was particularly talking to when he made that statement.
Yeah, so one of the important things to understand about Irish history is that Ireland has always been a sore spot in the British Empire. And that's because Ireland has always been a place of revolt against tyranny. Okay, there was a saying in Irish families from early on when Ireland was subjugated in 1541 by King Henry VIII. And it was this: every Irish generation must shed blood to free Ireland, right? And so between 1700 and 1916, there are over 20 major revolts in Ireland against British rule. One of the things that Irish Americans struggle with, and I noticed this very much in my last trip to Ireland, Irish Americans really struggle with the reality that in Ireland, they are social justice minded, heavily social justice minded. They have universal health care. When the Ukraine, actually right now they've put themselves in a bind because they took so many Ukrainian refugees because they would not say no, right? They just took these people, kept taking them. Ireland, even in Ireland's national anthem, there is a phrase, and it says, never again will we harbor the despot or the slave, meaning never again are we going to be ruled by a despot, and there will never be slavery here. Equality is a huge thing in Ireland. Social justice and social-minded progress is very important in Ireland. That does not square with the Irish American that has grown up in white ascendancy here, right? Where you'll be hard pressed to find people that have my opinion that are Irish American, right? And that has a lot to do with the melding post Civil War in becoming white and how we exchanged that greenness and things we gave up. One of the biggest examples is to join the KKK, you can't be Catholic. Well, guess what Irish Catholics were? So isn't it odd that in 1845 there are caricatures of us that look like monkeys? But by 1916, we have presidents sending senators to Ireland to advocate for revolution for an Irish republic. Something changed. Something changed. Yeah.
Might makes white. Yeah, and that's I mean, that's the core lesson. That's how it came together. It was. I know, reading history, knowing history, that they were outcasts here. They were ridiculed. You can see a lot of. It's like you see the memes, the pictures of black people being ridiculed. You can see a lot of that. So, what was the? How did it happen? Was it? I know we read the book, but was it a slow process, or was the process okay? We're going to use this for political power, social power. When the Irish became white, I'll put it like this. I'll ask it like this: do people in Ireland today who've never been, do they consider themselves white, to like Irish Americans?
No. No, they're Irish.
They're Irish.
Right? Yeah. They are Irish or Celtic. Some of them would call themselves Celtic or Celtic.
Yeah. And how do they feel about?
They're actually what you will find outside of Northern Ireland, right? In Northern Ireland, there is a supremacist piece of society, Ulster Volunteer Force, basically people that want to remain part of Britain. With not everyone in that group, but within that group, they fly Confederate flags. They are supremacists, right? Not necessarily white supremacists, right? Because they're attacking other white people in Ireland, but they are supremacists, right? They don't believe Irish culture is on par with British culture. And so how this happens from the research that I've done is it looks like it happened over time, right? So in 1845, when there's this massive influx of Irish immigrants, America doesn't really know what to do with it, right? It's eerily similar to what's happening right now, right? As issues are occurring in Central and South America, and we're getting a massive influx of immigrants, allegedly. The same fears existed for the Irish as the Irish came over, right? The fears of they're going to take our jobs, they're going to take, they're going to rape our women, and they're going to ruin this country. The immigrants are going to ruin this country. I mean, the same tropes are paraded out. Last week, and over Christmas, we had a governor that decided it would be okay to put, toddlers in 18-degree weather in D.C. and just leave them there with no jackets. It's the same thing over and over and over, right? With the Irish, what happened is when they first got here, they weren't a majority, right? And so when you're not a majority, you can be treated however the majority wants to treat you. Mm-hmm. The problem that occurs is between 1840, I looked at census records, between 1847 and 1865, the start of the Civil War, the Irish in America had gone from like 1%, 1.5% of the population to 8% of the population, right? And that's just immigrated Irish. We're not even talking about people who were born here that are now Irish Americans. Mm-hmm. So you're probably looking at 10 to 15% of the population, of the white population, is Irish, right? So that begins to present a problem, right? So what I suppose in the book, and this is just my theory, is that what happened is there became so many Irish people in this country that the ascendancies, the supremacists, had to make a decision. Mm-hmm. They had to decide either we bring them in, right, or they are going to ally with people who are like them, people that have suffered like them. So they did two really smart things. The first thing they did was they said, hey, we'll let you in, but only at the bottom rung, right? And so you'll still have to compete with black people and other immigrants for jobs. Like, we're going to let you in, but you can't get up here with us. Mm-hmm. You're going to be like the doorkeepers, right? You're going to be the doorman. That did two things. One, the Irish now had the right to vote, right? And so they have this huge voting block that you have to acquiesce to or you're going to lose power. So we got into whiteness. The other thing it did is it got us to compete against free blacks, right? It turned us on the very people that had suffered like us, right? And so it was a two bird, one stone situation for white supremacy. They could still maintain their supremacy in numbers and also in power. So we were used, is really what happened.
But they still wanted to keep the Irish with the background in place. I remember it was a big deal when Kennedy became the first Irish Catholic president. He had to hurdle, he had to cross to get over because it never forever before in American history.
And previous to 1960, even a lot of Irish people don't realize this, but previously to 1960, here's what would happen. People would ask you, hey, what's your background? Irish people would never say, hey, I'm Irish. Because if you just said, hey, I'm Irish, that meant you're Irish Catholic. So they would say things like, I'm Scotch-Irish, right? It's a difference with a distinction, like you like to say. Scotch-Irish means my relatives come from the ascendancy in Ireland, not the poor folk, right? Not the commoner. I come from the ascendancy. I'm Irish, but I'm the right kind of Irish. See what I mean?
One thing I wanted to ask you, what was the church's role in this? I know it was. I studied the slavery issue. What was the church's role in the during that time with the Irish? How was the church role in this their warrant from whiteness to greenness, choosing whiteness, exchanging whiteness for greenness?
Yeah. So really, what we see is when they came here, and one of the things I didn't cover in the book that I wish that I had time to do was covering the Mexican War of 1848, right? Because you have the San Patricio Battalion that were all Irish immigrant battalion that fought for the Americans. But they were not, because they were Irish Catholic, they were not allowed to practice their faith, right? And so what they ended up doing as a battalion was basically committing treason and crossed the road and went and fought for the Mexicans. When they were found in Mexico City at the end of the war, they were all hung, right, for treason. That says a lot about what was going on as far as religion was concerned, right? The white ascendancy, which was basically Episcopalian at the time, the Great Awakening hadn't really occurred yet. So you didn't have a lot of the Baptist and some of the things you see here today, but the Episcopalian, which guess what, is a carryover from the Anglican Church, right? When this became an independent country, they couldn't call themselves Anglican anymore. So they renamed themselves Episcopalian. This is the same church that in Ireland repressed Irish Catholics, right? There were laws that said if you were going to build a Catholic church in Ireland, it had to be made of wood, so you could easily burn it down, and it could not be attached to a road. So it could not be on a main road. So if you wanted to build a church, it had to be off the main road and it had to be made of wood. Could not be made of stone. During the famine, one of the interesting things that the Anglican Church did, or the Church of Ireland, which is basically Anglicanism in Northern Ireland, they would send out missionaries. And tell me if this sounds familiar. They would send out missionaries, and these missionaries, their goal was to go feed the poor Irish people that were starving from the famine. That sounds great, right? But here's what they would do. They would set up these tents and have all this food in there. And the Irish would line up, these people that are starving to death. They would line up, and they would come in the tent, and they would be presented with all this food. And then they would tell them, if you want the food, you must denounce Catholicism and you must become Anglican right now, or you can leave and starve to death. Because nothing says the love of Christ like starving people to death, right? So if you look at the church's role, now it's not as pronounced. I think it's fair to say it's not as pronounced in trying to maintain the Irish in a lower class as it was with African slavery. I mean, they went so far as to create a Bible with specific passages removed, so that when the slaves were preached to, they wouldn't be told about freedom and liberty and liberation and things like that. So it wasn't that far with the Irish, but it was a tool of suppression. Absolutely.
Wow. The forgotten struggle. What you mean by that? The forgotten struggle.
Yeah. So one of the things that Irish forget is the struggle that happened in Ireland. Right. The struggle for independence, which was, the first. I mean, parts of Ireland had been conquered in 1066, right? Ireland has been a colony for almost 1,000 years, right? In some way, shape, or form. Some piece of it has been a colony of the Anglos, right? And we often forget what struggle we had against Anglos and the primitive white supremacy, right? Before, because it comes over to America and it kind of really gets that white supremacy, right? Because here you have the amalgamation of multiple ethnicities that become white. Well, in England, it was just the Anglos, right? So there is an entire struggle there that I think if we would read about and if we would take the time to understand, we would start to realize, why are we aligned with the power structure? Like, our history has never been aligned with the power structure up until now, right? Frederick Douglass saw it. O'Connell literally told people, if you're going to America and you're going to be pro-slavery, you are not Irish anymore. He said that, right? So there has always been some distinct differences between the Irish Americans who come here, right, and grow up in this environment, and then Irish that fought in the struggle, lived through the struggle. It's a very different feeling over there. To the point where there are a lot of people in Ireland, and I can't say I blame them. If you go over to Ireland, if I go over to Ireland, talking the way I do, right, like I'm from Texas, and I say I'm Irish, they will immediately correct me. No, you are American. You are not Irish, right? Because there's still this feeling of like you left. Not only did you leave, but you have now ascribed to all the things that we were against, right? And there's still kind of that feeling there.
The revolutionary mindset.
Yeah. Yep.
Greenwashing. Was it, in the end, is it all about money?
Well, it is.
It comes money and political power, and
it really that's what it boils down to, right? And this is the one thing I always want to make sure I tell people. Like, I wrote this book, and I don't want people to think that I believe if I would have come here in 1848 with my family and would have been presented with a choice, hey, starve to death with the free blacks, or turn on them and your family will live. I'm not going to sit here and say I wouldn't have made that choice. I am not saying that. I'm not blaming people who were in a very bad situation to come here and have to do horrible things to be in a better situation. I'm not going to pretend like I would be the hero. I would. My daughter starts to starve. You'd be surprised what you do when your children are starving. So that's not the point of this. The point of this, though, is as Irish Americans, we need to look back on our history and own our part of it, right? There is a part of the American experience that we have to own. We have to take responsibility for our actions in doing that. And it's not about, I should be punished because my relatives supported slavery or, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is it's okay to say, wow, that was terrible. What do I have to do to make sure that never happens again? What do I have to do to make sure that my children understand that they are in a position of privilege because of how they look, and how to leverage that to help all people, right? Because that is Irish. That is authentically Irish.
People, they can miss me with that. I think King said it best in the Birmingham letter. Privileged groups seldom give up their privilege.
Yeah.
I don't care.
I think he was being nice. I would say never.
Stop. Stop it. I mean, like I wrote in Scars, everybody puts down Thomas. And but Thomas in that moment.
Right.
Everybody now saying, you know what? You don't know what you'd have done.
No, you don't.
But you had to believe that a man that you seen get crucified, not toe stepped on, crucified,
right,
was alive 3 days later when it never happened before in history. Come on, stop this. We need to stop this. What we would have done.
Right.
The part that I really hate about my country is when you try to deny the history,
right,
because you don't want to so-called make nobody feel bad about what happened because they are assigned to a race that you created.
Right.
You created this, but you don't want them to know what their ancestors did,
right,
because they might feel bad about that. That's all the game. And then it's the same thing with this Deion Sanders situation. It makes sense. All these people talking about what he should. Are y'all going back to the hood that you was raised in? Stop it.
Let me tell you something. I'm never going back to Marbach and Southwest Military Drive. It ain't never going to happen.
Telling a man what he should do, as if you in his mind, as if you're his God, if you make decisions his life, because you're saying what he should do with his life. The notion that people got a right to tell people, and then mostly people have never cared about an HBCU before. No. But now you're an expert on it. And the only reason you know about it because he went there, because you watched him play football. And that's the only reason you know about it and cared about it. But now he should do something. But you stand in your good neighborhood. You're not moving back to the hood that you came from. Right. But he should stay here because he needs to send a message for. I mean, he's a football coach. And I like that you said that. And we'll close up with what might have been. But we need to stop this looking back on history and saying what we should have done. History is not designed to say what you should have done. History is designed to look back and say, how can we grow from this, so that whatever the atrocities in history never happen again. Right. Because you don't know what you're going to do in the next 10 seconds. That's let alone know what you would have done 200 years ago in a different... Just saying, when I got so mad when I was watching the show on Emmett Till. Oh, and when they came to get Emmett, and they said, call the police. Dummy. Ignorant.
Call the police?
In
those aren't the police.
The police and the preacher there. You can't call there. Black people can't have you had no agency to call the police in Mississippi in 1955.
My God.
Y'all are just so you don't understand how context, and we always talk about context. Had no clue about. They should have called the police. You wouldn't have done nothing.
No, you would have shut your door, drawn the blinds, and pray that he come to your house.
Exactly.
That's reality. So I mean, we could sit here and talk about
because I got a privilege now to call, but I didn't have that privilege then. Right. What are you talking about?
Exactly.
Remember the context, and we forget that, and you close what might have been. So I didn't want what might have been.
Yeah. So to me, I wanted to kind of give an alternative history, or kind of what could have happened had the Irish made a stand, right? Had done this impossible thing and said, you know what? We're from Ireland. We've had 1,000 years of being treated like crap. We're gonna take a stand here. Again, something that I don't blame them for not doing that. Mm-hmm. When presented with, I can't even handle it when my AC goes out. Yeah. So starving, all that stuff. Yeah. So we can play the game all you want. Mm-hmm. But in that chapter, I just wanted to show how you can make a difference, right? What could have changed? So when we look at the censuses 1910 to 1940, we start looking at, kind of getting into the modern era. We find that if you combine Native African and Irish American, right, you combine those three, there's, I think I did the math, like 35 or 40% of the American population. That's almost half. Yeah. Right? That is a very significant voting block. Had we at some point along our journey had said, you know what, we're going to do what our relatives in Ireland are doing, and we're going to take a stand against this oppression, right? Had we had done that, there may not have been a Jim Crow, right? The First Nations probably wouldn't have desert land. They would at least, I think it's unfair to say they would have gotten all their land back. There's no way no one's going to do that. Right. But they, with 40% of the voting people behind them, you know, I think I took New York City, for example. New York City or Boston, Irish and African, over 50%. What you're telling me is if those two came together and had a list of demands, they would be met, or you would just not be in office, right? So there's a power there is a power in the vote. There's a power of collectively voting, right? And had we have had a change of heart and had consensus with other oppressed peoples, the outcome could have been different. Maybe not, because a lot of times when you vote for things that the power structure doesn't want, the power structure can turn violent to try to save its power. So, you know, it's just a what if. All I was pointing out is that a lot of things could have been different voting wise, right? The Jim Crow laws probably would have got voted down, but the Irish in America were presented with a choice, even in the 40s, right? We either go along with the people who are murdering Emmett Till, or our people will start to get murdered like Emmett Till. Because the other thing about being allowed in, right, is they can push you back out, right? So I understand the fear. I understand the fear of losing whatever privilege you had. And now, you know, as in the 80s, 90s, you know, post John F. Kennedy, we are essentially white, right? Like we have every privilege other white people. When I say my last name is G and my grandmother's name was O'Dwyer, nobody freaks out because of the O, right? When Irish people came here in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, they would take the mix and the O's off their name to make it sound more English. So it's just what could have been. It could have been different. Yeah. It really could have been.
You know, and that's the thing about we got to understand. You know, I thank God that, you know, we serve the King of Kings, and of His kingdom there is no end. But our duty and what, you know, what you did in this book is really bring home to what we need to understand is context in our history, because what we have could have been different.
Yeah.
It don't have to be. And people, even today, people coalesce toward power. We just drawn. You know, we're drawn to the biggest church.
Right.
You know, that church is successful because they got 10,000 members. You only got 2. So your church can't be of God because you only got 2 members and they got 10,000.
Right.
Well, that's not said it's so, but you're gonna follow crowd. I mean, they're not doing nothing. People coalesce to power, numbers, bigger. It looks better because that's how we tie success. You know, you know. And I look at Jesus, man. If you tie success like if Jesus, we count success. Well, Jesus would have been deemed a failure compared to how we count success.
Yeah.
But we love power. We graft out the power. We want to be in the crowd. We want to be in the crowd. So this book is good. How, you know, it can happen to, and I'll say this, and I'll let you have the last word on your. Nobody understands power like white supremacy.
It's true.
Nobody understands power like white supremacy, and they will beat you to it because they understand. Right. But them, it's not emotional. Yeah. It's not spiritual. It's not sentimental.
Yeah, it's not even personal.
It's just power.
It's just power. Yep.
And how can I make sure that I'm in a position of power? But I thank God that we serve the all-powerful God and the all-power Jesus, and of His kingdom there is no end. But this is a great work. Hope you get it. Exchange of greenness for whiteness. How the Irish in America surrendered their culture with the privilege of whiteness. So. Yeah, that's good.
So you can get it on Kindle. It's on Amazon. You can contact me. I'll get you a signed copy, however you want to do it. But the biggest thing is just, you know, I wrote this for Irish people. I think everybody should read it, of course. But I wrote this for Irish people as a wake up call. We need to understand that yes, we are privileged, and we have the opportunity to pivot that privilege. Yeah. And we need to decolonize ourselves. A lot of people talk about the decolonization of natives and African Americans, but there are cultures inside of white supremacy that need to be decolonized as well, and the Irish are one of them. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So it's 23.
It's 23.
So what are you? We're gonna have our show. We'll be back on every Thursday, and we're gonna have a schedule. We're gonna get in our battle rhythm, run the tape, ask your brothers.
Yep.
What else? What are you working on for this year?
Yeah, so I am working on another book. Yeah. I think what I'll do is I'll dabble in some historical stuff, but that's not my niche. That's not my heart. My heart is theology and reclaiming and decolonizing my Christianity, right? So going back to a Celtic Christian authentic experience. And so that's, I'm writing a book about that experience. I'm not going to give the title out. I learned something from you. I'm not going to say nothing.
No.
If you want to know, you got to buy the book. So
you need your book release, have your unboxing,
that's right.
Everything.
That's right. So so that's kind of what I'm working on right now. Still doing the podcasts, and still working with churches that are struggling, with their leadership. Yeah, I'll be gone for half of this month, up in a couple of different places as we, go into places where, abuse has happened or violence or, and abuse in many different ways. But now's the time. The church needs to have a great reformation and a great flipping of tables. It's time. It's long overdue.
Yeah, I'm working on my next book also. It's probably going to be a 24 release.
Okay.
I'm in the early stages of development. Got it in my mind and starting to put things down. So I go through the process, and I learned some things from this last book too that I'm gonna be better at. And it's gonna be pretty much in the same line as Scars, but a different topic that God has given me and just put together. And so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about development into the writing. And I would like to people, the reason why I write is because one day I'm not going to be here.
Yeah. And
I don't care how good you preach, I don't know how good you teach, I don't know how good you talk. One day you're not going to be able to.
That's right.
And what are you going to leave behind? And I want to leave behind, not that I'm making any money off of it, that one day when I can't make a penny off of it, or that somebody get help in this thing we call life.
That's right.
I thank God for the work of O'Connell. I thank God for the work of Douglas. I thank God for the work of Martin Luther, all these great people who left their words behind for us to read. And I tell people this about we try to tell my kids. Think about this. The reason why we know the Word of God is because they put together this thing we call a book.
Right.
I don't care how far we go in society, people are going to read books.
It's true.
And I can testify that people are going to read books.
Yeah.
And if you are thinking, and I'll tell you this is my encouragement hour for books, because I'm telling you, the book for me was spiritual, therapeutic. It helped me grow as a person.
Yeah.
It helped me develop. I had to go and research. And I'll tell you, whoever cares to listen to this statement, nobody can write your book but you.
That's right.
Nobody can write your book but you, and your book is waiting for you to write it. And I don't care if you write it and you are the only one to read it. It's still your work. It's still your unique perspective. I don't care how good a book is and how great an author is. That author can't write your story.
That's right.
They can't write what God has given you, and everything is unique. And you might think it's been written before, but it hadn't, because it hadn't been written by you.
Yeah.
So if you think about writing, if you want some pointers on writing, we're here to support you on
Absolutely,
that.
Yeah.
But it's just a matter of sitting down and do it. But I found nothing is for me. It's very therapeutic. It makes me a better person.
Yeah.
It makes me it's helped me grow and develop, and I thank God for it. And I thank God that what we know about God, the research you've done, was only because somebody wrote it in the book.
That's right.
Because I don't believe they had internet back in 1850.
That's a fact.
1850. And so
somebody wrote it down.
Somebody wrote it down where you can research and you can learn from your people. We can learn. So believe it or not, with all this gadgets we have, people still read them.
That's right.
And so write your story and don't let nobody take it from you. So in 23, my encouragement going into the year, I'm pretty much believing resolutions. Start thinking about writing your book.
Yeah.
Start putting it down, typing it out, and you'll find a great piece.
Yeah, and I found great therapy in writing books. I'll say probably my biggest leaps theologically, just my relationship with Christ and what I believe about Scripture and how I believe Scripture and theological stances I have, a lot of those come from doing the research to write books. I learn something new every time. With this new book that I'm writing, when you actually, just simple things like, when was the Bible one book? Mm-hmm. Right? And the reality is, for the first 400 years of Christianity, there was no Bible. Mm-hmm. So does that change how I look at the Bible? Does that change how I look at the early church, right? Like, there's a lot there to unpack that you can learn. And I have done great leaps about it. And I've actually gained more respect for the oral tradition, both in my own culture, other cultures. Yes. If it wasn't for oral tradition, there would be no Bible. Right? Because nobody wrote it down in the moment because nobody thought they would need to. Exactly. Right? So, the oral tradition and the writing of books, it is very therapeutic for me. And it teaches me every time I do it.
Yeah. And that's because we know. All right. Well, we'll be back here next week with our battle rhythm. We'll get started and we'll put some information on our Facebook page, TikTok, and
absolutely. Till next time.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of Bishop Brothers. Make sure to visit our page, Bishop Brothers, where you can like and follow so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, please tell a friend about the show. The brothers salute you. Until we meet again, Godspeed.